The hip scour is a passive test that looks at how wide a client's stance needs to be to get the greatest amount of hip flexion. That hip flexion translates to depth in the squat. But the hip scour can also give us an idea of whether someone's capable of a conventional deadlift or needs to use a sumo stance. During the hip scour, we'll be looking to answer three questions. How wide do the knees need to be to get the maximum amount of hip flexion? Is there enough range for 90 degrees of hip flexion in a narrow stance? This is specifically for the conventional deadlift. And is there any hip impingement pain or lower limb pain? You won't need any equipment for this test, but you will need a flat surface with enough space for the client to lie down and for you to move around them. Let's have a look at the test. I'm going to have Joe lie on his back and rest his hands on his chest. This keeps them out of my way so I don't accidentally step on a hand or an arm. He can have his knees up or his legs outstretched, but in either case, his feet need to be wider than his hips. This is going to limit any rolling of the torso from messing up the test. From there, I'm going to kneel alongside him and pick up his leg closest to me. Notice how I'm holding the leg. I'm using a low, underhand grip of the calf. I'm going to use that inside hand to drive the knee forwards and backwards. My outside hand goes on the lateral side of his knee, not on top of it, and I'll use that hand to control how the knee moves from left to right. Before I go any further, I'm going to move his leg around to make sure he's nice and relaxed. If he's not, I'll remind him to relax, but if that doesn't work, I'll get him to take in a deep breath and to breathe out slowly. Hopefully his muscles will relax a bit as he breathes out, and I'll use that time to move the leg. Once I'm satisfied that his muscles are relaxed, I'll begin the test. The first thing I'll look at is whether he can achieve 90 degrees of hip flexion in a narrow stance. A narrow stance is typically hip width, but for the conventional deadlift, it can go as wide as the shoulders. I'm going to bring that knee in line with his hip and start moving it up his torso. If Joe's muscles were tensed, this is when I'd get him to take a big breath and let it out slowly. I'll keep moving that knee up the torso until I feel light resistance. This is the femur coming into contact with the hip socket. Have a look at the angle of hip flexion to see whether there's at least 90 degrees. If there is, great. Make a note of it in the performer and move on to the next question. If not, maintain light forward pressure on that hip socket and watch how the knee begins to go wide. This is the femur following the arc of the hip socket. Keep going until that knee is as wide as the shoulder and have another look at the angle of hip flexion. Is it at least 90 degrees? If it isn't, then avoid the conventional deadlift and use the sumo deadlift instead. If there is 90 degrees or more hip flexion, you're good to use the conventional deadlift, but you'll have to use a shoulder width stance. Now we need to have a look at hip flexion relative to the squat. Keep letting that knee go wide, maintaining light forward pressure with the leg, and see how much hip flexion you can get. Now you're starting to look for how wide that knee has to move to get the greatest amount of hip flexion. Keep in mind that you want this to apply to the squat. At a certain point, the width of someone's stance becomes ridiculous. You can go to the outside of the shoulder, but I wouldn't go much further than that. But don't be afraid to go the other way too. Some people will have more hip flexion in a narrow stance than they will in a wide stance. Once you've found the optimal knee width for the greatest amount of hip flexion, make a note of it in the screening performer. Is it hip width, shoulder width, outside the shoulder, or somewhere in between? Next, I'll ask Joe whether there was any hip impingement or lower limb pain during the test. Once all that's done, I'll move to the other leg and repeat the process. If you find that one leg has less flexion than the other, use the leg with the least amount of hip flexion as your reference for squat depth. Before we move on, here's a few points to keep in mind during the hip scour. Don't force the body's movement past light resistance. Don't bring the knee high enough to roll the hips off the ground. And lastly, we need the data we're collecting to relate to performance of the squat and the deadlift. So keep the femur in a neutral or externally rotated position and keep the sole of their foot pointed down the axis of their body. The data you've collected in this test can be compared to the quadruped rock and the squats tests. For the quadruped rock, you want to compare the optimal width for maximum depth. If one test shows less hip flexion than the other, stick with the smaller amount of hip flexion. It's better to underestimate their depth and find more later than it is to overestimate it and risk injury. For the squats tests, you're looking at the same area. optimal width for maximum depth, but you're comparing their passive capacity with their active capacity. The hip scour can show you how deep their structures will let them squat, and the squats test will give you an indication of how much of that potential they're actually using. To sum up, the hip scour is a passive test that looks at how wide a client's stance needs to be to get the greatest amount of hip flexion. That hip flexion translates to depth in the squat. The hip scour can also give us an idea of whether someone's capable of a conventional deadlift or needs to use a sumo stance.